everyone. Great news, I have a new microphone finally, so please let me know if the audio is significantly better this time. In today's episode, I will be discussing what gentrification is, where has gentrified and why, and where is set to gentrify in the future. Anyway, let's get started. What is gentrification? The textbook definition of what gentrification is the process where a poor urban neighborhood is changed through the increase of wealthier demographics moving into the suburb. This increases both housing, business, and also displaces current inhabitants out of the suburb. A lot of people tend to get gentrification and rejuvenation mixed up. There is a clear difference between both of them. So, what's the difference between gentrification and rejuvenation? So, rejuvenation is where the fascia of the suburb tends to improve. So you'll see greater, looking buildings pop up. You might see new townhouses. You might see knockdown and rebuilds quite a lot. But that's not gentrification, that's rejuvenation. Gentrification is simply where demographics of the suburb increase to a wealthier level. That's the difference between both gentrification and rejuvenation. So let's get into an example of what rejuvenation and gentrification looks like. So the example I'm going to use is Braybrook and Yarraville. So both of them are west of Melbourne CBD. Braybrook about 10 k's, Yarraville about 7. So the difference here is Braybrook in the last 10 years has had a lot of actual dwellings become knocked down and rebuilt into beautiful townhouses. Now, that has changed the fascia of the suburb completely. They look very nice, but it hasn't quite gentrified yet. Whereas Yarraville has had people earning above $2,200 a week, which is roughly their median weekly income, move into the suburb, therefore gentrified it by an increasing demographic moving into the suburb. So that's an example of gentrification and rejuvenation and the difference between the two. Let's get into some examples of gentrification that has happened in recent years or recent decades. So the first example I'm going to give is in New South Wales, and it's actually Bondi versus Tamarama. So obviously two really expensive suburbs, but I'll give you an idea of what gentrification has happened there. So previously in the mid-2000s, Bondi was actually more expensive than Tamarama, believe it or not. Now, the reasons for that is obviously because Tamarama was less known than Bondi, and Bondi as well was kind of your premier Hollywood type suburb. Tamarama was less known, but still less known than Bondi. So you can see here, this is in the sort of 2010s, the early 2010s and late 2000s. You can see Bondi was actually more expensive than Tamarama, believe it or not. But today, Tamarama is actually more expensive than Bondi. Now, if you look at realestate.com.au or any other, price metric chart or price metric actual website, you'll notice that the median price of Tamarama is around $7 to $8 million, whereas Bondi is about 4 to 4.5. Now, it's really interesting to see that, but why has this all happened? It's really crazy. Now, Bondi and Tamarama are two different suburbs in terms of supply. So Bondi itself has a lot more stock on market and a lot more development happening. So generally you'll see what happens in Bondi is you'll get detached houses, you'll get townhouses, you'll get units, you'll get villas all come up for sale quite regularly. Whereas Tamarama is mainly detached homes. So generally because it's mainly detached homes, you also have a wealthier demographic that generally reside in the suburb. So of course Bondi, you have plenty of wealthy people, but you also have a lot of temporary residents, also especially internationals. You have other residents who might be only there for 6 months or so. So that's quite common in Bondi. Whereas in Tamarama, you mainly get mostly owner occupiers that stay in the suburb long term. Now, aside from that too, you also have the fact that Tamarama and Bondi actually almost have the exact same access to all the facilities and services of each other. The only probably clear difference is there's a few more bus lines that go to Bondi than do Tamarama, but that doesn't make much of a difference in the suburb in terms of if they're right next to each other, because it doesn't change too much of the actual, should I say, price demand for it and actual rental demand either. So that's a good example of what can happen over the future if you're picking the right suburb to gentrify, particularly if there's a restriction on supply. Let's get into one for Victoria. So a good example of Victoria is Brunswick and Coburg. Both, I'd say are both in the inner north of Melbourne. Here's an example of their prices in sort of the early 90s. So you can clearly see here, Brunswick is significantly more expensive than Coburg. But basically what happened is that in today's market, you can see that they're actually very similarly priced. Now, to give everyone an idea, I'd argue they're actually the same price. I know it looks like Coburg's more expensive here, but it's mainly because here, a lot of Brunswick's actual streets in the suburb do have a lot of units in them, and Coburg doesn't. Coburg is mostly detached houses. So to give everyone an idea, it's roughly the same price. But the reason for this is actually really interesting. In the 90s, believe it or not, the late 90s, in 1997, they actually had a prison in Coburg. So it was called Pentridge Prison, and that had been in existence for nearly 100 years and actually closed in 1997. So before that, believe it or not, there were actually a lot of prisoners' wives that actually lived in the suburb, and agents wouldn't even sometimes list houses in the suburb because they're too scared to, and they just sell them completely off market. So you could pick up houses in in Coburg in the 90s for literally like 100 grand, and they wouldn't even show up to market. So that's one of the reasons that the suburbs actually gentrified quite a lot, which is really interesting. Another reason is there's a lot larger land lot sizes in Coburg, and they have very similar development laws. So if you're only 5 minutes away, whereby you have the same transport infrastructure to get to the CBD, what happens there is most people prefer a larger dwelling on a larger block. So people realised that, and they actually started buying in Coburg as it started to clean up post the prison closing down. Furthermore, as I said, it had cheaper entry prices as to Brunswick over the past. Now, today it's not the same. You'd probably be better off to buy in Brunswick now because the money has mostly been made in Coburg. But in the past, if you had the chance, it would have been a great place too. Another reason is Brunswick's obviously known for its walkable neighbourhood, and it's a fantastic neighbourhood to walk through, no doubt. Though Coburg does have a very similar high street kind of neighbourhood as well, with great walkability, especially in the town centre, the tram, and great other bus lines to the city, which only take a couple of minutes longer. So that's why it gentrified quite a lot. And you can see a unique example nonetheless, but how the changing nature of demographics with a prison closing, it's actually heritage listed now, can actually change the suburb and therefore gentrified in the future. It, of course, led to rejuvenation at the start, but it is now gentrified and a lot of the money has been made. A final example I'd like to give everyone is in Queensland. So it's actually an inner Brisbane suburb called West End, and comparing it to its neighbour Highgate Hill. So to give everyone a bit of background on both of these suburbs, Highgate Hill has been a fairly upper middle class for most of its actual history. However, West End was known as quite a rough suburb, quite a fair bit of public housing there, and known for quite a few strip clubs and brothels actually being there as well. So historically known as quite a rough suburb. So here's an example of the prices in the 1990s. This is the early to mid 90s. So you can clearly see here that Highgate Hill was quite significantly more expensive than West End. Today's prices, Highgate Hill and West End are actually very similarly priced. Now, again, it'll look here like Highgate Hill here is a little bit cheaper. However, they're roughly the same price, to be fair. It's just the data there is quite small, so I've tried to make it as even as possible, but it is roughly even today. So it's very interesting in that sense because West End itself has cleaned up a lot, and that's one of the major reasons why it has actually gentrified quite a lot. But first things first, why has it really? First reason is really because it's got similar access to jobs. What do I mean by that? So a lot of Brisbane's population works in either the CBD, Fortitude Valley, the Woolloongabba district, Greenslopes, Hurston, or Cannon Hill. Those are your main employers. Now, both of them are almost similarly distanced to all of those together. So most people can work in any of those hubs that I've mentioned and still have similar access to the CBD. So that's one of the main reasons why it has actually happened. Another large reason is the suburbs, first of all, going through rejuvenation in the late 90s. So a lot of that public housing was sold off, and a lot of more regulation came in around a bit of the dodgy goings in the suburb as well. So that cleaned the suburb up, and then in the 2000s it started to gentrify. So you started to have wealthier people move into the suburb and therefore gentrify the suburb and create a much more wealthy demographic that reside there. Finally, both suburbs are by the Brisbane River. However, both have great water views, and you had properties in West End with almost the exact same water view and exact same frontage of the water, so for almost the same price, which was insane. So what people ended up realizing is you'd have people in those suburbs that then started to buy in West End. So that also created a change in the suburb too. So that's why West End now is a great suburb and is going to continue to be a great suburb, but previously there was some awesome opportunity for gentrification. What causes gentrification? There's a couple of things that I want to discuss here because there is a couple of reasons and a couple of things that do cause gentrification. First of all, affordability and the spillover effect. Second of all, access to jobs and opportunities. And third of all, lifestyle areas combined with jobs and opportunities. Let's discuss the spillover effect. So what is the spillover effect? The spillover effect, by definition, is where real estate demand from one suburb spills over into another suburb that is therefore cheaper. So there's plenty of examples of this in Australia. So a really good example of that would be like in Brisbane, where someone perhaps in New Farm can no longer afford the suburb, so they decide to move to Spring Hill. It might be in Melbourne, for example, where someone who can't live in Brighton decides to live in Hampton. It could be in Perth, where someone who wants to live in Peppermint Grove might decide to live in Cottesloe instead. So that's a good example of the spillover effect. And what happens there is you actually have the wealthier people that move into the suburb and therefore increase the demographics and change the entire nature of the suburb. So the spillover effect does have an effect on gentrification and is a major cause of it. Accessibility is another one. So if you have the same accessibility in a suburb, but it is significantly cheaper, generally that will help the suburb gentrify. Now, I don't simply mean a train line being there. I mean accessibility mainly to jobs. So a good example of that would be, for example, the Norwest Business Park in Sydney. So if you have a suburb where a business park is put, and then you've got all these buses that only are a 5 or 10 minute bus trip away, generally that will help the suburb. And also, if you've got really good access to the CBD too, that will also improve the suburb itself. So accessibility is another thing that can cause gentrification. Finally, lifestyle and job opportunities. So lifestyle does play a large part in gentrification, and it's mainly because people like to live where they will enjoy to live. So that's the reason sometimes that it can cause gentrification. But if you combine that with job opportunities as well, then the suburb is highly likely to gentrify. Look, good examples of this is somewhere like Tenerife in Brisbane. So Tenerife, believe it or not, in the early 1900s was actually a very industrial suburb. No one really wanted to live there. But over time, what happened was people actually realized that Tenerife is so close to the city, and it also was by the river and had some really, really nice properties available, so people started buying there. So that's a thing that can cause gentrification too. Over time, people will realize that areas with good lifestyle, should I say precincts, and also good job opportunities will generally gentrify in the long term. Now, it's not what causes gentrification, but it can cause gentrification in a lot of circumstances. Now, if you combine all of these things together, then you've probably got a high likelihood of gentrification happening. But there's obviously a lot more things that you need to consider. Finally, what are the next suburbs to gentrify? And I think everyone owes me one for telling everyone this, but let's get into it. Let's start with Victoria. So the two suburbs I best think are to gentrify next are Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West. So if everyone wants to know where they are right here as where I describe in the picture above. Anyway, what are the reasons for why Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West are going to gentrify? So let's start with, first things first, a little bit of the background and history of Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West. So they're both actually quite heavy public housing suburbs. And what's happened there is in the 2010s and late 2000s especially, a lot of that's actually been sold off. So that's actually just changed a lot of the scope of the suburb. It's gone through rejuvenation in recent years. So a lot of developers have actually held stock and actually developed it, and you'll see a lot of townhouses around there be developed. Now, the really interesting thing about Heidelberg Heights and Heidelberg West is that they're actually surrounded by all much more expensive suburbs. So if you go any direction, every suburb around it is more expensive. So Watsonia to the north is more expensive. Heidelberg and Rosanna to the east are more expensive. Also, Reservoir is more expensive to the west. And obviously south towards Ivanhoe and also Belfield, they are significantly more expensive. Now, they're close to both, obviously, Ivanhoe and Rosanna, which in Melbourne, and a lot of actual people from Melbourne will know this, are, I'd say, upper middle class suburbs, quite wealthy suburbs, particularly Ivanhoe East. You have a lot of suburbs on very large period blocks, and original blocks, should I say, period homes on original blocks. The other thing about them is they got great proximity to a lot of the schools in the area. So there's quite a few good schools in Kew, Ivanhoe and Hawthorn that are very close by. So because of that, a lot of people are happy to move there because they like to send their kids to school, particularly wealthier families. So that plays a large part in it too. Both of those suburbs also have really good accessibility to the city and town centres nearby. So Heidelberg itself and also Heidelberg West are actually really close to Coburg. They're really close to Heidelberg. They're really close to Watsonia. And they're only about 13 k's away from the city or so. So if you compare that to other suburbs that are similar distance, they're actually probably about $200,000 to $300,000 cheaper, depending on which direction of the city you go to. But both of these suburbs have perfectly good demographics surrounding them, and also perfectly good schools surrounding them too, which are major reasons why both of these suburbs are set to gentrify in the future. So keep an eye out for both of them in the future. Where are we thinking about in New South Wales is due to gentrify next? Now, a lot of people have all different opinions, but I've probably got one that I think probably most strongly about, and the suburb's actually Waterloo. Now, it's a very interesting suburb because Waterloo, for people that have grown up in Sydney, you'll know this, has been full of public housing. Is quite a derelict and also dangerous suburb if you read about it in the media, particularly from articles in prior probably to even 2010. Though similar to probably Redfern, Waterloo's going through a thing called urban renewal at the moment, but it's not only urban renewal, it's actually going through gentrification as well. So why is Waterloo set to gentrify? Now, Waterloo is incredibly close to the Sydney CBD, like very, very close. It is about 4 k's from the Sydney CBD, and you still pick up houses, and also like whether that's detached, attached or terrace houses for literally under $2 million, which you literally cannot find anywhere in the Sydney CBD for that. Like, it is impossible unless it's, falling over in Surrey Hills and you have to do $150,000 of work to it. So that's one of the reasons. It's obviously being close to the city. It's so close to all the jobs. To give her an idea, CommBank has their actual headquarters at South Everleigh, which is very close to Waterloo. It's pretty much a walkable distance from Waterloo. It's also with the metro line coming in, going to get a station. So that's going to only improve the accessibility to the city. So it's going to be, I think, 2 stops from the CBD, which is insane. So that's only going to improve it. I think it's actually going on the Barangaroo line from memory too, which is really interesting because that's actually getting a train station. Furthermore to that, Redfern in the 2000s was a good example of what gentrified. Now, what happened in Redfern there was, alike to Waterloo now, it was actually considered very dodgy. Though you have a cafe on nearly every corner in Redfern now. You have people earning $3,000 a week and above, that being very common in Redfern. You've got a really good town centre and lifestyle precinct in Redfern. You've got, the university close. You've got really high paying jobs very close by too, which is starting to come into Waterloo too. So that's basically what's going on there, and a reason why it's going to gentrify. Now, be a little bit careful where you buy, of course, but that's another reason as to why it's going to gentrify. Prices is probably another large thing. So Waterloo itself is actually about 30% cheaper than a lot of its surrounding suburbs. So especially Surrey Hills, it is incredibly cheap compared to Surrey Hills. You can pick up a place just as good in terms of the land size and also the interior of it as well in Waterloo for as much as you would in Surrey Hills, but should I say 30% cheaper? So not as much, but 30% cheaper. So the spillover effect will occur here, where people still want to have the same accessibility and lifestyle, but they'll live in the neighbouring suburb because they can afford there. So that's going to happen. I finally discussed as well, demographics are improving out of sight. So Waterloo in the last 15 years has had almost doubling of median income there, and it's only going to continue because continual high income earners are going to start moving in there, and that's going to continue to gentrify the suburb. So look out for Waterloo. A lot of Sydney-siders probably will have their own opinions of that, but in terms of making money and where's going to gentrify, it's a very good suburb in the future that will gentrify without a doubt. Let's get into another suburb. So a lot of people have reached out to me and also commented that I have a massive East Coast bias. Now, it's not entirely true, but the thing I generally want to do is let everyone know where the best suburbs are. And I'll tell you the vast majority are on the East Coast. Now, no doubt there are a couple in Perth, but definitely not as many, and definitely not the proportion of as many that you should buy in. But anyway, a suburb that's going to gentrify in the future in WA is a suburb called Rivervale. So for those who don't know where the suburb is, it's roughly 6 to 8 k's southeast of the CBD. It's close to Victoria Park and not overly far from the airport either. Now, if you look at this graph here, you'll see this is from Census, that Rivervale has had an increase in personal median weekly income of nearly 150% over the past 15 years, which is incredible, and it's up there with the highest in Australia. So you can see in 2006, it was close to the Australian average at $476 a week, and now in 2021, it was actually $1,015 a week, well above both the state and national average, which is just incredible, and you're not going to find that in many suburbs of WA, but that's what Rivervale has done. Now, furthermore to this, let's discuss why it is going to gentrify in the future. So, look, as I've discussed, first things first, you've got a major demographic shift in Rivervale. So, Rivervale itself has quite good access to a lot of the jobs in Perth. So to give everyone an idea, the CBD does have a lot of jobs. The other two main job hubs in Perth are generally Joondalup in the north and also Canning Vale in the south. So it's not overly far from Canning Vale, which is more so your kind of blue collar and trade kind of centre of Perth. And it's not overly far either from the expressway north towards Joondalup, which would probably be from the suburbs somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes on a general day. So it's actually it's kind of central to all of the jobs in Perth too, which obviously adds to the demand for the suburb because people can kind of live there and work in any of those three main hubs of Perth quite comfortably. Now it's close to also the Victoria Park lifestyle precinct. So Victoria Park is very close to Rivervale. Lath Lane also is, and they're very expensive compared to Rivervale. So Victoria Park's about $1.1 to $1.2 million. Rivervale is about in the 700s, closing on the 800s now. So it's quite significantly cheaper than that. It's also close to the Swan River and also Optus Stadium. It's actually close to the casino too. So for those that like playing roulette, that's a good suburb for you too. Not only that, the suburb's actually quite low in density. So most of the suburb there is actually houses, and most are actually detached. You still get houses there also on big blocks of, 800 meters squared to literally 6 k's from the CBD, which is just awesome. But that's something you've got there too. There's not many large-scale developments either, so you're going to notice that in the future, you'll see a lot of the surrounding suburbs, particularly towards that casino and towards probably Victoria Park, get a lot more high-rises. Rivervale won't get as many, so your stock levels are probably going to be a lot lower there, and that'll increase the, obviously, demand to supply ratio, which is good. Just a note of this suburb as well. So you do have a little bit of public housing in the suburb still, and especially towards Cloverdale, you have quite a lot and quite a bit of a crime issue there too. So be really careful when purchasing in this suburb, just simply because the suburb does have some quite dodgy pockets that you probably should avoid, but there also are some parts of the suburb that are exceptional and you should consider when buying. So for my WA friends, just consider this. It's a really good suburb to buy in. And yeah, I've actually covered it, so I hope you're thankful for that. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you're looking for a buyer's agent in Australia's best performing suburbs, be sure to reach out via www.compoundinvest.com.au. Thanks again, and welcome to the channel. I'll see you on the next one.